Hi, I'm Rodi Srivastava,
I'm Anuradha Nagraj.
and this is The Migration Story.
Every person here is a migrant. So I would say the whole story of Australia is a migrant story, to be honest.
And I also feel that this book and the story, in a way, bridges the gap between India and Australia as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Australians here had butchered his name. They actually, instead of a J, had made it a G, Bugga, instead of Budja. So I kept looking for Budja everywhere. I was telling my grandfather, I'm like, are you sure this is your dad's name? I don't think you know what your dad's name is.
I want to ask you, why is this story important to the larger community and for Australia?
So I think a lot of it is, how do we get the narrative out there? How do we actually make people understand that, we belong here just as much as the next person? With the current narrative around migration here, it's very important for the broader Australia to know that, and the world to know more broadly, that, we are a mosaic of cultures. We are multicultural. We're not just a single thread.
In 1885, a young man left the mustard fields of Punjab with nothing but courage and hope. Over a century later, his great-great-grandson is turning that journey into a children's book. Today, we are sitting down with Manmeet Bedi, the author of Where the Mustard Fields Meet the Southern Cross, a story about one family's migration from India to Australia, told across 3 generations, and why those stories are worth passing on. Thank you so much, Manmeet, for joining on this podcast for the migration story. You have a fascinating journey and would love to hear more how this started. Just to give you my background, so I am a founder of the Bidesia Project, which works on conserving folk music and oral histories from UP and Bihar in North India, which is connected to endangered migration that happened during the British time in India. So personally, when Roli reached out to me saying that this is the email that you've got, this is the book, can you do this for us? I said, yeah, definitely, more than happy to have this conversation and, just would love to hear more about your journey, Manmeet.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Simit. Yeah, it's been quite the journey, to be honest. So I'm a Melbourne-based author. I actually work in emerging technology. So I'm not an author or a writer by trade by any means. But my family has quite a long history here in Australia. So I'm a 5th generation Indian in Australia.
Yeah, quite fascinating, right? It started with your great-great-grandfather, right? Tell us a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, so my great-great-grandfather, Mahan Singh, arrived in 1885 in the port of Melbourne. So he came here with 40-odd other men, Indian men. So we also remember that at that time, there was no such thing as Australia, really. It was all the British Raj. We were all part of the British Empire and the colony. I think it was, closer to the fall of the Sikh Empire as well. So, they came here to initially build some of the sleepers on the railway tracks, so build the railway roads here in Australia. But when they came, there wasn't modes of transport like there are today, and people that helped you, and migration agents and things of that nature. They had to be quite self-sufficient. So the story goes that they actually had to walk from the port of Melbourne up until Queensland, far north Queensland, which is a 4,000 kilometre journey, a walk. So you can imagine these Punjabi men with their pagdis coming up and having conversations with each other, not knowing anyone. And it was very difficult because there wasn't, as I said, modes of transport. So they had to try and navigate their way through the bush. And the story is that apparently there were Indigenous people, so Aboriginal people that are native to Australia, that actually helped them on that journey. They actually had paved ways already around how to get through the bush. So they actually helped navigate that way. And then in 1901, my great-grandfather, Bidesia Singh Garawal, came to Australia. And that's when the White Australia policy really kicked in. And it was stronger in certain states. So New South Wales, which is a state in southern Australia here, it was a very strong policy where people of colour just weren't allowed to pass through. So the story again goes that guards would get drunk at around 12 o'clock every night at the Albury-Wodonga Bridge, which is the bridge between Victoria and New South Wales. And when they got drunk, they would pass out and they would sneak past at that time. And during that time, they would have to then try and find food and shelter. So there were a lot of good people, obviously Australian people, that helped along the journey too, where, these Punjabi men didn't know how to speak English. So they would moo like a cow to try and get milk, or they'd cluck like chickens to try and get eggs. One man would stand, another one would stand underneath him, and they'll try to get eggs. And they made that brazen journey of 4,000 kilometres to the far north cane fields of Queensland, where they cut sugarcane. And you also remember that these men came from, the agricultural lands of Punjab, so they were farmers anyways. They understand how to cultivate the land, and they became quite ingrained in Australian culture in terms of the farming land here.
That must have been really fascinating for you, right? To get to know about these journeys, and because they are so personal, like imagine, like today someone walking 4,000 kilometers from one part to the other and, going through the fields and, all those experiences. It's almost like a movie story.
It is. It did feel like that, and the Australian archives here are really well documented. So the amount of information that I found about my great-grandfather around his, for example, a certificate of exemption, you needed 3 references from your employer. So he actually had references from his employer saying he was really well regarded, he worked hard. There was letters to the Commonwealth around trying to get his wife over to Australia. She passed away, sadly, but, there was letters back and forth. There was, his journey going back and forth from Australia to India. So the other thing is women weren't allowed in Australia till, women of colour weren't allowed in Australia till after the 70s. So they also, I think it was the 60s maybe, I could be wrong there, but it was very difficult for them to even have children. So they would have to go back to India, obviously, and an example is my Nanaji, my grandfather, when he came to Australia in 1947 and he got to my great-grandfather's home, he didn't know who he was. He was looking going, who's my dad? I've not seen this person before. I've seen him once, maybe when I was 4 years old. He was 17 when he came here. So he had to ask around going, who is Bhuja Singh Garwal? And that was the first time he actually properly met his father at the age of 17.
A lot of families seem to have been like disjointed, right? Because earlier your great-great-grandfather went and then your grandfather went. And I wonder like why they are like migrating independently and not like together, or why they are not together. So I think that kind of in a way answers that as well.
Yeah, there wasn't a policy allowing women to come at that point because men came for labour. Australia was a new nation in lots of ways. In the 1700s it was founded. So it wasn't necessarily a strong economy and a strong infrastructure. They actually got people from the British Raj to help build that. And women weren't seen as integral to that because they weren't seen as the muscle. They saw the people of India as muscle. So, that is part of the reason. I didn't understand either. I was like, it's very bizarre. Why are people coming back and forth again and again? But that was the reason. So technically, everyone that came was first generation because they all had to be born in India because the women couldn't come. But I guess from lineage, in terms of migration, as I said, I become 5th generation from that perspective.
I mean, this story also breaks a lot of myths, right? In terms of Indian community, the Sikh community, because like until then, you thought that you're the first generation, but I think your story is actually a lot of myth busting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've probably seen in the news recently the kind of heat Australia is getting around migration and the treatment of Indians, and it is something which obviously affects me as well and everyone else. But this journey actually kind of revealed to me, to your point, that myth that we are newcomers, we're not welcome here. Someone tells you to go back to where you come from. I say, well, I probably came here before you did. So, what does that question of migration or identity mean all of a sudden? And that is a question that has seeped into the narrative when I've spoken to people, because, when you see some of these racists on TV, all of a sudden you turn around and say, well, actually, that doesn't make sense because they're first generation or second generation. So it does actually begin to raise these questions around identity and what it means to be Australian, what it means to be Indian, what it means to migrate. Because technically in Australia, unless you're a First Nations person, someone who's Indigenous, every person here is a migrant. So I would say the whole story of Australia is a migrant story, to be honest.
Absolutely, and a lot of times that part gets missed out, right? And probably the same debate in the US as well, right? Like, who is the real American? Because then you have to go back, really, unless you're the indigenous, community, you're not really. So the question is like, who is the real American? And in this case, like, who is the real Australian?
That's right, and it does then start to bring questions around values. What does it mean to have Australian values or American values or Indian values? And I think in some ways, because all these nations are actually quite new, it's not like India that's been around for, since the beginning of time. These are new nations. And I think lots of times they probably grapple with their own identity and values as to say, what does it mean to be Australian or American? A lot of people can't answer that themselves.
Like the stories that you have found out, and I'm sure like in your research, you would have come across many stories. If I had to ask you what's been the most fascinating part, while you were researching, while you were like going through all the archives, what's been the most fascinating part for you?
It's a really good question. What's the most fascinating part? I think actually understanding that we have been here for a very long time. One interesting fact that came out that my grandfather didn't know is he had a brother that passed away when he was 4 years old. And this happened prior to him being born and the rest of it. But that family lineage kind of was quite interesting. But I think the broader narrative around Indians in Australia have been here a long time. It led me to the discovery of Indians being hawkers here in Australia for a long time as well. So they sold goods and services to people around here. And probably the most interesting that came out of that was how well regarded they were. So, there's this narrative that you think when you think of other, you think of America, like you mentioned, and other places where people were brought against their own will as slaves and weren't well respected. Actually, that brings the point around. I think the most interesting fact when it came to people having rights here, because we're part of the British Raj, Indians had the right to vote, the right to a pension, and the right to bring dependents back. So in some ways, if you look at the law today, they had more rights in 1800s than some of the asylum seekers have today in Australia. So that was really fascinating. I mean, how much it worked in practice is another question, in terms of could they actually vote and do those things. But that was really fascinating to think that these people were considered citizens of society. They weren't considered pure labor or slaves or anything of that nature. They came here legally and were legal citizens. That was really fascinating for me. I think beyond that, the most fascinating thing was actually seeing the image of my great-grandfather. So I saw photos of him from his certificate of exemption test, which I mentioned was something that allowed him to come back in the country. So generally people of colour or not of Anglo-Saxon descent, very difficult to pass a dictation test, what you almost have as IELTS today. Very difficult to pass unless you're a native English speaker. So they almost discriminated on that grounds to not let people in. This certificate allowed people to actually move back and forth through Australia and other countries. And his handprint was on there too. And sometimes I just look at it and try to work out, are the lines similar? That's something which almost gave me goosebumps when I saw it for the first time. So lots of really cool facts that came out.
So while this is like a very personal story for you, right? But I want to, like, this is not just your story, it's the story of a larger community as well, of people similar to your great-great-grandfather who migrated to Australia. I want to ask you, why is this story like important, like to the larger community and for Australia?
Yeah, you're right. And I said that as well. I said, part of it is it feels like a family story, but if you read my book, Where the Mustard Fields Meet the Southern Cross, which is what I created out of this particular narrative, it is just a migrant story. So when you talk about why is it important to the larger community, if I put the Indian community to one side, which I'll talk about in a second, but if I talk about the larger community here, the number one story that came out from people that weren't of Indian descent was their migration story. So, some of my closest friends here who are, you just assume they're Aussie, they're Australian, but they've got Polish grandparents or Greek grandparents, things of that nature. They started telling me about their story. They said, "Oh, my great grandfather was a prisoner of war during the World War II, and he saved a whole bunch of people. He had a Medal of Honor." Another lady who I was speaking to, a good friend of mine, we were having a coffee, and I was telling her this story about how my family was in the sugarcane fields of North Queensland. And she turned around and said, "What year?" And I said, 1900 something. And she said, "You won't believe this." She said, "My great grandfather was on the sugarcane fields in 1900 as well, in that particular area." And all of a sudden we started thinking, our great grandfathers probably knew each other, 5 generations later. What a story. So I think for the non-Indian diaspora, there's a broader migrant story, which is very important. It opened up narratives to people that are, for lack of a better word, Anglo-Saxon or white descent. I had a whole bunch of Irish people telling me how they never felt like they belonged to, England, and what their journey was like there. And I just had to go, what do you mean? As a person of color, that's very difficult to understand when you got this homogenous, Anglo-Saxon race going, I don't feel comfortable here either. So that was quite amazing from, I guess, the non-Indian community. How does the broader Australia actually feel about their own journey? And then I think the Indian community, like you said, it's very important as well, because they're actually able to understand that, we didn't come here yesterday. We've been here for a very long time. We're not guests here. We're founders. And they have just as much of a right to be here as anyone else. And the reason why I actually put it into the narrative of a children's book is to make sure that next generation understands that. So, one of my really good friends, his daughter is half Greek, half Indian. She looks more Indian than she does Greek. And she said, when she saw the book, she said, "Is this me? Am I an Indian girl? Did my grandparents come this way too? And I want to take to school and show my friends." And, that was the reason why you do it, is to make sure that people understand that, the Australian story is a mosaic. It's not a single thread. And I think that's been forgotten over time, with the current narrative around migration here. It's very important for the broader Australia to know that, and the world to know more broadly, that, we are a mosaic of cultures. We are multicultural. We're not just a single thread.
Yeah, that's very perfectly put. It's never never like a homogenous sort of community, right? There are many people, many communities over a period of time. They build and they work together to build a country, right? It's not just built by one community.
Listeners, do stay tuned. We'll be back after this short break.
Forty-year-old Zarina Khatun has been struggling to switch from her LPG stove to a biomass-based cook stove. She says it's extremely difficult to cook on it.
धुआं लगता तो खांसी नहीं आता, सर्दी नहीं होता। चूल्हे में तांच लगावेंगे, धुआं होगा तो आँख नहीं होगा, इन्हें होगा तो कैसे होगा? खाना बनावेंगे तब तो होगा।
LPG grew scarce in India, sending prices soaring and pushing hundreds of migrant workers back to their villages.
Watch the full video on how the LPG black market collapse has hit migrant settlements only on the Migration Stories YouTube channel.
While you were researching this, while you were going through, tons of data and information, you would have possibly thought about how do you kind of put that out, right? Like, how did you boil down that you want to do an illustrated story, and that too for children, and not maybe for a larger audience, or not? Was there a particular reason why you spoke, why you chose a very specific target audience, which is the children?
Yeah, part of it was, I suppose, I have two children of my own that are 4 and 7 years old at the moment. And, when I found these records, I obviously was floored and thought, wow, this is amazing. And again, I told a couple of my friends and, family, and, they all pat you on the back. But, beyond that, it was a question around, that's fine, but how do you build it to the previous question around a broader narrative around what this means for the story of, Australia and India and how they're kind of integrated and linked together in some way. And telling my children that story, they kind of looked at me and said, so what? What's 1800? Was that when you were born? They don't have a concept of time. They don't even know when it's lunchtime. So let alone, what was 140, 50 years ago. So when I started telling them this story, they're like, that's cool, but I don't really grasp the concept. And that's when I tried to put it into a children's narrative. Again, I've never written a children's book before, but I thought, I want to do something for my kids. So I put it together and my youngest is absolutely in love with it. It's been 6 months or so since I released it, and he still asks for it every night to be read. And they almost know it off by heart now. So a lot of it was actually making sure that, yes, one part of it is captured in terms of the history more broadly, which I've got in the back of the book, a bit of a timeline around when we first came, what that meant for the fabric of Australia. But then more broadly, I thought having that narrative for children so they can understand what this means, and also understand not just my own children, but Australian children. They actually understand that we've been here for a while, and if you really do want to fight things like racism, you have to do it at that early age. And when people see people of colour in books like that are diverse, I think that narrative opens up much faster, much quicker, and hopefully, as they progress through life, they already have quite an appreciation of about what it means to be someone different other than what they're used to see in picture books.
Absolutely. I'm also wondering what's been like the role of AI and technology, like in this process for you. Could you walk a little bit through that journey as well?
A few things I've used in terms of tools to try and capture the story. So one part is my Punjabi is okay, but it's not great, particularly when it comes to things like dates, right? It's very difficult. It's not in the same function as it is in English. So when my grandfather would say, a certain date, I'd sit there going, I have no idea when this date is. So I sat down with my grandfather and a few other elders and actually recorded what they had to say. What was their journey? What was their family's journey? And then I transcribed that. I created transcription, and I used AI tools like Microsoft Copilot to actually translate that from Punjabi to English. And that actually gave me the dates and the timeline. I said, okay, this is quite good. I asked it to summarize what does that journey look like from the 1800s to now, and it did quite a good job. Obviously, double checked with the source itself to make sure my grandfather said it was correct. So that transcription and translation was very powerful for me. It almost bridged this gap that I think I wouldn't be able to bridge without the use of something like AI. So that was the initial part, and then I suppose the next part, as I mentioned earlier in the interview, was I did try and find those records in the past through Ancestry, through the National Archives here in Australia. And I'm not a historian. I'm not a, genealogist. I didn't actually understand how these things work. So I kept coming up blank. AI was very powerful in pointing me exactly where I needed to go, what that actual website link looked like to find that Ancestry record. So previously I'd look for electoral records, I'd look for shipping logs, and I just came up blank every single time. This AI actually said, if your grandfather came or your great-grandfather came between these dates, you need to go to this section of the electoral roll, you need to go to this council, you need to go to et cetera, et cetera. And it really drilled down exactly where I needed to look, and I got my first hit. So when I got my first hit, that was quite exciting. I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. I got a bit of a journey. So AI played quite a role in terms of translation, transcription, and researching it. But interestingly, I didn't find a lot of the records until I met some historians here in Australia. So I went to the Sikh Museum here in Australia. My book was inducted there. And there's a whole raft of information around, the first Indians that came to Australia. And I said, wow, who's put this together? And they said, there's 2 local historians in Melbourne. You should go check them out. So, I knocked on their door and we had coffee, and turns out they had actually interviewed my great-grandfather. And his name was Booja, so it's Booja. But the Australians here had butchered his name. They actually, instead of a J, had made it a G, Booga, instead of Booja. So I kept looking for Booja everywhere, going, you guys don't even know what, I was telling my grandfather, I'm like, are you sure this is your dad's name? I don't think you know what your dad's name is. So we kept going back and forth. When these historians told me, I went to the National Archives and I had a look and I got a hit. I had to request the archives to actually archive the information as well and make it a digital copy. But through that process of having a human in the loop, so AI obviously pointed towards all these great things, but the historians being able to tell me, hey, this is how you spelt his name. I found almost 60 records relating to him that were just sitting there as well as being archived. So it was this interesting, I do work in technology, so I'm obviously quite pro-technology, but it was an interesting arc in the narrative around how, technology will take you so far, but humans will probably take you a little bit further.
Wow, that must have been like when you figured that, okay, it's just a G, like that one word has completely changed the view, right? There are so many similar stories because of indentured migration. When that happened, like from UP and Bihar, people went to Mauritius, Fiji, and the officials at that time, they couldn't necessarily pronounce their name, or so they would write while it would be a very different name. And when they went there, for example, I'll give you an example. Naidu, for instance, you would in India, you would write Naidu, but when people went there, they added double O at the end instead of a U, for example. And a lot of people, who tried to find their ancestors, they couldn't do that because of that small change. So it's fascinating, these stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I looked at some of the archives, people there was beer singing there, BEER, you drink a beer. So there was, I think, they obviously, and even when you look at some of the actual records and then you look at what was actually digitized, the Aussies at the time, or the Australians now, clearly don't understand what Indian names are because they were completely different. Missing vowels, as you mentioned, Naidu would be double O or whatever it was. They try to make it more phonetic because they can't actually pronounce it themselves.
Absolutely. What's been the response so far?
The response has been pretty amazing. As I said, I was doing it purely for my family and, maybe a couple of friends just to see what I could do. But it's been quite the journey. So, I've met lots of mayors here in Australia that have promoted it. It's in a whole bunch of libraries and schools. I recently met the education minister here in Australia. He was very keen to see how he can get it into schools as well, more broadly. And I think, one of the really cool things was it became a bestseller on Amazon. So within the Australian history category and the multicultural biographies category. So it was completely unexpected. And I think it was more unexpected from, I suppose, the non-Indian Australians, the Australians here. Because, you can understand people might look at it and go, well, this is an Indian story. But I think what came out of it was a lot of people saying, actually, this is an Australian story. This is a broader story about our history. It's not just an Indian story. So, I mean, the love and I guess the backing from both the Indian society here and the Australians has been absolutely phenomenal. Something that I just couldn't even have imagined when I first wrote it. I don't know if I'll do a follow-up, but it's a lot of work. But I think it was a really nice surprise, and I'm very humbled by it.
Yeah, I mean, if it's the number one sort of on Amazon in Australia in a certain sort of category, I mean that's a amazing start, right? But where do you go from here? What next with the book and your journey?
Yeah, I mean, part of what I'm trying to do, potentially there's a second book. I mentioned that 4,000 kilometer walk. I'd like to document that in some way. But I think a lot of what I'm trying to do now is get the word out. I want people to understand that, as I said, Indians are part of the fabric of Australia here as well. We are a migration story, just like any other culture that has come here. And we've contributed a lot to this country, and it should be recognized. So I think a lot of it is, how do we get the narrative out there? How do we actually make people understand that, we belong here just as much as the next person? And how does that change the narrative around what's currently happening in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also feel that this book and like the story, in a way, bridges the gap between like India and Australia as well, right? So any final thoughts that you would want to share, like on that front?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think part of my journey and understanding how this has come about is also connected me so deeply to my roots in India. I found out that my great-great-grandfather came from the village of Daliwal and built the first Sikh temple there. So, being able to understand that, the Indian diaspora has a place in India as well as in Australia. And I think people understanding that journey that, they might take as well at some point. When I look at my cousins, and I have a lot of them, there's only a handful that are left in India. They've all migrated outside, rightly or wrongly. But the point being that, this is a story that can also hopefully, if people are thinking about coming here, make them understand what it is like, what that journey was like for the people before them, and also make them feel like they've got a place here, but also be proud that Indians have contributed so largely to Australia, and we should be really proud of that fact.
Absolutely. And while I did say that was my fine question, especially in India, where we are passionate about our cricket, right? And I'm sure it's the same in Australia as well. Do you get conflicted when the two sides are playing each other?
Look, if I'm being completely honest, I was taught from a very early age that I have to go for India. So I've never owned an Australian cricket top. It's always been an Indian one. I was a mad Indian cricket fan, probably in the early 2000s, when Sehwag and all these guys were dominating. You'd go to I think it was also something that really bonded us together here in Australia, because, now that I think Indians make up the second largest or the first largest migrant population in Australia. But growing up, that was not the case. There was a handful of us. So you'd go to the cricket, and this was before the Swami Army and all that existed, early 2000s. We'd all band together. So it would be a raft of Australians, and then it would be, a handful of Indians. And I was probably one of those, waving the Indian flag pretty proudly and loudly. And I still do. I mean, I've got 2 kids now, so I don't get much chance to do leisurely things like go to a 5-day cricket match. But yes, for your Indian listeners, they'll be very happy to know I am a very proud and passionate Indian cricket supporter.
Well, that's amazing to know, Manmeet. I wish you all the best for your book, and I hope that it does well and that you're able to promote it as actively as you're doing in Australia. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Manmeet.
Check out our website www.themigrationstory.com for more content. You can subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and Spotify. The audio editing and sound design is by Akshay Ramuhalli. Stay tuned for more stories on migration.
The Migration Story.